Please take your seats. So my name is Akiko Fukuda-Parr, and I'm from the New School, but I'm also the director of the independent panel on global governance for health. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the New School, and we'll have 2 very exciting days. But for now, I just want to introduce Dean Watson, Mary Watson, Executive Dean of the Schools of Public Engagement at the New School, who will give some welcoming remarks. Thank you, Mary.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sakiko. It's a beautiful after Halloween morning where we see the temperature has dropped to about 30 degrees since yesterday. So I hope you're enjoying the drier air and the cooler skies. So before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge with respect the indigenous peoples on whose land we are now seated, this land not having been ceded voluntarily by them or their ancestors. So the topic of today's conversation is a quite heady one and a quite important one, and it's quite appropriate that it be hosted here at the New School in partnership with the Studley Graduate Program in International Affairs, a program that has been working on reimagining and redefining the ways in which the global geopolitical relations have been working in the world for, I think it's since right after 9/11, founded right in the week of 9/11 in New York. We're also proud to be partnering today with the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo, and the conference titled Political Origins of Health Inequities, Technology in the Digital Age is quite timely. This year at the New School, we're celebrating our 100th anniversary. So when the New School was founded in 1919, it was a very complex time in the global world order. This was in a time of anti-war sentiment, in a time of rising nationalism and fascism around the world, a time of the development of complex geopolitical, economic, social, and other kinds of conditions. And so here we are 100 years later, and it turns out that some of those things I just said could be said very much about today. So I think the contribution the New School has made over the last 100 years is to actually engage in these issues in public dialogue, in scholarship, and creative practice, and in trying to shape civic life and democracy. In fact, one of the things the university's founders were known to have said was that the institution was designed to oppose outrages against intellectual liberty and to promote the study of human affairs in order to renovate democracy. I certainly hope you will have accomplished at least some of that by the close of the day tomorrow. And now at the 100th anniversary, we're looking forward to the next 100 years to really ask about what the future of this university and education in general is. And the topic that you're discussing today is quite apropos. The university has always prided itself on engaging in pressing issues of the day and to be engaged in what the founders referred to as activist scholarship, that is, scholarship that actually matters in the world on the pressing world issues. And so today's topic about technology and inequity is a really important one, especially as it's applied to the healthcare arena. So a neutral look at healthcare and technology might suggest that this can be a route to the solution of many problems, and yet we also know there are social consequences, unintended and perhaps in some minds intended, of the intersection of these technologies. And as Virginia Eubanks wrote, new digital technologies can function as a digital poorhouse to actually punish the poor or disadvantage their access to resources. So the challenge of governance, and I think this is part of the conversation today, is to ensure the ethical and equitable use of technology in the health space. And I'm looking forward to hearing you dive deeper into these topics today and tomorrow and hear more about what the solutions might be. So I thank the University of Oslo for their collaboration in today's conference. And I also want to acknowledge that we have had over the last 3 years exchange students from the University of Oslo at the New School, and we have very much enjoyed and appreciated their presence in our academic and intellectual community. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Katerini Storeng, Associate Professor at the University of Oslo Center for Development and the Environment, to continue today's program and to do some more introductions. Katerini.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, everyone. So welcome to this conference, the second conference of the Independent Panel on Global Governance for Health. And first of all, I'd like to also add my thanks to the New School and, of course, to Sakiko Fakudapar for hosting this conference. At the University of Oslo, I lead a research group that brings together scholars from anthropology, political science, history, and development studies to study the politics of global health. And we've been really privileged over the past few years to work with Sakiko on the Independent Panel. Now, the panel was created to follow up on the Lancet University of Oslo Commission on Global Governance for Health. Now, the purpose of this commission was really to direct attention to what was labeled the political determinants of health and how governance challenges, not only within the health sector but also outside of the health sector, affect countries' and society's ability to shape public health efforts and create health equity. So last year, the panel organized a conference in Oslo that dealt with the politics of universal health coverage, or UHC. And this was a great interdisciplinary discussion that's resulted in a special issue of Globalization and Health, the journal, which is going to be published hopefully this month. So for this year's conference, we decided to focus on technology as a political determinant of health equity, and with a specific focus on digital technologies. And it seems a timely choice, as was already said. The World Health Organization's Director General, Dr. Tedros, said earlier this year that, quote, harnessing the power of digital technologies is essential for achieving universal health coverage. And this was earlier this year when the WHO released recommendations on 10 ways that countries can use digital health technology accessible via mobile phones, tablets, and computers to improve people's health and essential services. And the WHO is currently developing a global strategy on digital health that is scheduled to be discussed at next year's World Health Assembly. And just 2 days ago, The Lancet announced that it has partnered with the Financial Times for a joint commission entitled Governing Health Futures 2030, which is all about growing up in a digital world. And the commission promises to examine the potential of artificial intelligence to improve healthcare for the world's poorest, and is soliciting ideas for how to do so. So I hope that they're going to be tuning into our discussions today to hopefully get some good ideas. And together, I think the initiatives of the WHO, the Financial Times, and Lancet suggest that there is a growing global political awareness of the power and potential of digital technologies, but also of the governance challenges involved in this ongoing technological revolution. The question really remains how we can harness digital innovation for the public good. Will the spread of digital technologies globally really improve health equity, or will it introduce new challenges? So over the next couple of days, we hope to address these kinds of questions through open and critical interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral discussion. So our starting point is very much that technological innovations are not neutral, that they have profound social and societal impacts, and that they raise a number of challenges. So it's not self-evident that, as the WHO seems to assume in some of its writings, that digital technologies will, quote, serve the vulnerable. So indeed, just last week, I saw a study published in Science that reported that algorithms used by hospitals and insurers to help manage care for about 200 million people in this country have been shown to systematically discriminate against Black people. And this is just one of the ways that we see unintended effects of digital innovation. So we're very excited to be here and to look forward to 2 days of a fantastic array of speakers from diverse disciplines and perspectives who will address both the potential and the limitations of technological innovations to improve health equity. So they will really show us whether technological innovations produce opportunities and constraints, and how this depends fundamentally on what technology is developed, for whom it's developed, by whom, and for what purposes. So before we hear from these speakers, we're really privileged to be about to see a video address from the World Health Organization's Director General, Dr. Tedros. Somebody will play. Thank you very much for your attention.
Artificial intelligence, virtual reality and machine learning digital tools offer exciting and new opportunities for health. Dear colleagues and friends, from robotic surgery to artificial intelligence, virtual reality and machine learning digital tools offer exciting and new opportunities for health. But they also raise new questions and pose new challenges. Digital health brings together the tech industry, which operates in a fast and less regulated environment, and the life science industry, where clinical trials and evidence are of paramount importance. Dear colleagues and friends, the benefits of digital health, we have to address the governance gap, the trust gap, and the ethical considerations. Crucially, we must make sure digital technologies serve to narrow inequalities, not widen them. That's where WHO can play a vital role. At the World Health Assembly last year, WHO's member states asked us to develop a global strategy on digital health. As part of WHO's transformation, we have also established a new department of digital health and innovation and a technical advisory group of external experts. Our aim is to advise countries on how to maximize the opportunities of digital technologies while avoiding the pitfalls with appropriate regulation. Our commitment is working with all countries and partners to harness the power of digital health for a healthier, safer, and fairer world. I thank you.
So thank you very much for these opening remarks. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Philip Alston, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty. Of course, Philip really needs no introduction, but I just want to comment that in his many years, going over the last few decades, as the leading champion of economic and social rights, I think what's remarkable about his work is how he has stayed at the forefront of innovation in addressing new challenges and keeping up with the world as it evolves. Starting, of course, in the 1990s, he was using human rights principles to challenge structural adjustment programs. And so it's not surprising that today he is taking up the question of how technological innovations are driving welfare state systems in such a way as to be, in many ways, contrary to human rights principles. So we look forward to hearing from Philip with great anticipation.
Thank you very much, Sakiko. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I first met Sakiko back in the early 90s when she was doing brilliant work in terms of shaping the UNDP Human Development Report, which was really a path-breaking enterprise back in those days, and if anyone was at the cutting edge of new topics and new approaches, and creative uses of technology, that, of course, is not for government. That's for the private sector, because there is profit to be made. And so that's where the heavy emphasis on privatization, public-private partnerships, blended finance, whatever other buzzwords you want to use comes in. And so we essentially see the private sector as being in charge of the sort of inquiries that I presume you're going to have in the next couple of days. In other words, how could technology actually better serve the entire community in terms of its health needs? And we know part of the answer to that, I'm afraid, despite the mentions that were made of the Lancet and the Financial Times and others focusing on healthcare for all, including the poor. The reality is that if the private sector is in charge, the poor won't be in it. That's just all there is to it. There's no money in it. I'm sorry. There's no reason why the private sector would be developing innovative technologies. Government is busily in the welfare area being shrunk as much as possible, and I'll come back to this in a moment, through the creative and innovative uses of technology. But it's not so as to generate money that can then be used to assist the poor by other means. That is then over to the private sector. And the private sector is going to serve a certain segment of the community, but certainly not those who are considered to be poor in any sense. So to go back, I'm not going to summarize the report that I presented to the UN a week or so ago, which is available to anyone who can navigate the absolutely impossible UN websites in order to uncover where it might be hidden. But I just want to make a couple of broader comments. I think one of the things that strikes me is the speed with which we are moving in very different directions, and of course it depends what you're reading, as always. It's not quite a question of the New York Times versus Fox News, but it's not far off that. So if you're reading the New York Times, you will read about various congressional Congress members getting irritated with Facebook and pushing back against some of the big tech and calling for, if not regulation, something or other that must change. And one gets a sense, well, there's a rational debate going on here, and perhaps some of the limits will start to be set. But if you then move to the other side of the street and start looking at some of the industry websites on, for example, biometric ID systems, which last year were worth only, I think, $19 billion, but which will, the market for which will soon be 3 times that. It's a hugely growing area. And what you see is rapid movement by the most amazing array of countries. France has just announced a whole new biometric approach which is going to transform their national system. Brazil, and this is a really exciting development, particularly with President Bolsonaro keeping a close eye on things, is going to develop a comprehensive biometric system to track all of its 140 million citizens. Australia has come up with legislation which has just hit a small road bump in a parliamentary committee which says this is bad news and shouldn't be done, but you can rest assured that the government will, over time, move right on ahead with it. And one doesn't have to stay in the global north. Again, the industry websites are full of stories about various African countries that are moving now, Nigeria moving to finger vein recognition systems because fingerprints are out of date. You can rub off your fingerprints if you actually do some serious work. Mine will be intact for a long time, I think. But India, of course, 1.2 billion people registered under Aadhaar, and a whole range of other developing countries all quickly saying we need to get all of this moving. And then you've got other developments that are not so much in the national ID arena, but which are inevitably going to feed into all of this. So again, I think Malaysia announced that it's hoping to have within 6 months, at least on flights to Japan, not sure why only Japan, but this completely barrier-free flying where you get out of your car and you walk straight onto the plane. And you don't need to do anything in between because you've been facially recognized and approved at so many different points along the way. But that, of course, means, and United Airlines apparently aims to do that here within 2 or 3 years, where people flying in the US will not need to show any ID, etc., because they'll know all about you as you're coming. I'm sure, of course, they'll tell you that you can opt out of it, and you can bet that a lot of people will opt out of it, yeah, because the alternative options will be made so unattractive that no one will actually opt out of that sort of system. But these link in ultimately then to the broader set of concerns because we're moving ahead in a whole range of different ways to open ourselves up to ever greater surveillance, monitoring and so on, and we're putting very, very few protections in place. I want to make a few points that are figured in my report, and then I'll finish up and hopefully have time for a few questions. First of all, my argument is that the welfare state, as I call it, broadly defined, I don't mean the Scandinavian models or whatever, I mean any effort by governments to ensure basic welfare provision to its citizens and others, is in the digital area always presented as an effort to make services better, to make them more efficient, to provide a better interface with government, and to promote higher levels of well-being. It's very funny, if you look at some of the legislation, if you look at the UK Act, if you look at the Aadhaar Act, whatever, they're all the same. You know, what's the purpose of this national ID system? It's to make life wonderful. That's what it's all for. And in fact, what I see is that they are essentially being used for quite different purposes. In the welfare area, to automate, obviously, to predict, so we have all these problems with various forms of data analytics, to identify people, to surveil, to detect, to target, and to punish. What we're seeing is that the new technologies are extremely helpful in terms of bringing in more or less round-the-clock surveillance of people. Lots of creativity being used. Australia is already actually testing the sewage in certain areas to get a sense of where drugs are being used most prolifically. There's no reason why the sewage pipe leading from your house should not actually be monitored, so we can actually get a sense of what is in your systems in terms of alcohol and drugs and whatever else we might be interested in. And we can then calibrate our welfare assistance, because after all, we need to know this sort of stuff. And those sort of assumptions are quite commonly shared in fact when we look at welfare systems. You know, you read about the what's her name, Chiara Bridges has written this great book on privacy, particularly for women in the US welfare system, focusing particularly on women of colour, but the extent to which, if they are pregnant and in need of forms of government assistance, the sort of demands that are then made of them are really quite extraordinary, not just in terms of information and data and so on, but in terms of their behaviour. You know, if you do this, you won't get that, etc. And so having a better picture of what all of us do in all of our time is going to be very important. You can rest assured that for some years to come it won't affect people like us. It's only the down and out, so you don't have to worry about it. The problem is that once you experiment with the poor, it's going to come to a place very close to you before too long, because the principles are put firmly in place. Next, what I've observed in many countries is that the digital welfare state is something of a Trojan horse, I'd say, for promoting neoliberal hostility to social protection. It's used to focus obsessively on fraud. I'm sure you know that welfare systems in the United States and everywhere else are absolutely riddled with fraud. There are huge rates of fraud. People are ripping you off and scamming you in all directions, except for the fact that the statistics show that welfare fraud in the US is half as great as fraud in government defence travel claims, for example. In other words, in almost, certainly in developed countries, welfare fraud is pretty limited. But if you were to read the newspapers, you will see that the picture of ubiquitous fraud is used often to justify the need for new digitized systems to enable us to match all sorts of data and thus identify people who are said to be scamming the system. Next, one of the big trends that I think we're seeing is an unthinking rush to embrace these new technologies, biometric IDs, digital welfare systems, and so on. It's a bit like the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, the digital system first, and then not just the law later, but even the purposes or the objectives later, once we get this in place. It's happening, for example, in Ireland. Classic. The Irish government is usually quite rational, but they've moved ahead very quickly with this public services card, which now covers 3/4 of the population. What's it going to be used for? Oh, nothing. It's just for, people to get driver's licenses or a couple of things like that. And then, of course, in the media, every now and then there's a suggestion, well, the new public services card could also be used for X or Y. And so what they're doing is setting up this comprehensive database, which they say is not biometric, but it actually has facial recognition, which is one of the definitions of biometric and is the foundation for much more sophisticated data matching and so on. And they've been told by the Data Protection Commission in Ireland that this is not justified, that it's not it cannot be done on the basis of existing law, but more importantly, I think that they haven't actually thought through why they want it, why they're spending so much money on it, and they're setting something up to generate the question by government ministers, well, why don't we use this comprehensive database to achieve lots of other objectives? The government, for now, has completely rejected the Data Protection Commission's recommendations and said that it will fight it out in court. In Jamaica, there was a very good decision, in fact, by the highest court. which rejected the Jamaican system on the grounds, again, that the government had not thought through the uses and why they needed to collect all of the different types of biometric data into a single system. And it's a similar thing is also being litigated right now in Kenya. It's funny, the Kenyan ambassador came to the UN a week or so ago and challenged me and said, "You've referred to Kenya and it's not true. We're only really doing this to, I don't know, enable the citizen to have a better choice, and it's not mandatory." At which point I was able to pull out draft legislation. It's true, it hasn't been passed yet, but in Kenya these things are not usually in great doubt. And the draft bill that was produced in July basically says, yes, it's not mandatory, you don't have to get a card. It's only mandatory if you want to, and then list everything. It's not just driver's license, it's get access to school, it's have anything to do with the financial system, which means opening a bank account, getting any form of government benefit, being able to vote, and the list goes on and on and on and on. This is the single comprehensive one source ID system that the government of Kenya is building up. And that raises, of course, grave issues about the rule of law. If we know much about Kenya, it doesn't have a particularly glorious history of protecting civil liberties and ensuring that governments will not abuse for corrupt purposes the sorts of opportunities that are provided beautifully in the form of a major database of this type. Next, just to mention briefly the role of the private sector. Many of these welfare systems are being sold in the first place by the private sector. Excuse me, Minister, we can save you half of your budget. And we will not just provide the hardware and the software, but we'll actually run it for you. So at a certain point in Nigeria, MasterCard had its logo on the national ID card because they had got the contract for paying out benefits. They were, of course, getting their 3% or whatever on everyone's benefits. But the private sector, then you get into all of these issues of the design of the relevant algorithms. Those are retained by the private sector. They're not even accessible often to governments or the courts. I think there's a serious set of issues relating to democracy because we don't have any serious debates over a lot of these developments. We're having debates now over Zuckerberg and our Facebook accounts, etc. But governments, meanwhile, are moving right ahead with the biometric ID cards. And what I have found in some places is that government officials, government ministers in particular, seem to know all too little. It's basically someone has told the minister this is a great innovation. You want to be at the cutting edge. You want to really be seen to be innovating. Yes, yes, yes. You want to be able to cut welfare fraud. Yes, yes. Let's do it. And no one is saying, well, it's going to cost X numbers of millions or billions of dollars. And welfare fraud, you might save 100 million if you're lucky, but you will end up losing a lot more money and at much greater cost because of the levels of intrusiveness into the private lives of people and so on. And we're just not having the sort of debates around the introduction of these systems that we need to have. I will finish. The reference was already made to the discriminatory dimension of a lot of the algorithms, the fact that they exacerbate a lot of the racism and sexism and so on that are already in existing systems. I think one of the things that amazes me is the north-south dimension of all of this. We've all spent a lot of time debating various forms of colonialism and so on, but the way in which these digital systems are being transferred strikes me as something that would make any 19th century white explorer in Africa extremely proud, in terms of systems that are being developed in the north by white men of a particular economic strata, and then simply being transposed to the south and eagerly embraced by the relevant governments rather than scrutinized in any way. And finally, I think the challenge for this conference in some ways is, if we can possibly do it, is to step back and say, look, if we assumed that what I call the welfare budget could be kept stable or could be restored to a decent level even, how could that better be used as a result of introducing new health technologies? In other words, not what savings can we make, not how can we reduce the human interaction, not how can we eliminate compassion and other sort of factors from the health system, but how could we really develop technologies which are not designed for people like me, waiting for my next heart attack or my next stroke or my next whatever, because I'm rich enough to pay for all of that, but are designed for people who don't have a lot of resources, who have a great many needs that are absolutely not being catered for. But it's going to require something of a rethink of the overall economic system. It's where I started and it's where I finish. If we accept the neoliberalism straitjacket that there should be no serious government intervention, that taxes should be ever lower, and privatization should be applied in as many areas as possible, then we're not going to develop innovative health and welfare systems that have the interest of the poor at heart in any respect. Thank you. Okay.
Well, we've run over time, but I think, I think we can't resist asking Philip some questions. So I think those of you who have questions, do you mind just going to the microphone there and lining up? Do we only have one question? Any other questions? I think you just have to line up. There are two microphones there. So, and I think we'll take like 4 questions and see if we have time for a second round. So please, please introduce yourself first. Before I give you the full, let me just remind you that there is this Twitter land, and the hashtag is Tech4, numeric 4, health equity, with capitalized tech, health equity. Thank you. Yes, please.
Gabriel Latarinos, Energy Poverty Mentors International. Thank you very much for...
Can you turn on the mic? I think so, yeah.
Gabriel Avgerinos, Energy Mentors Poverty International. Thank you very much for the walk around the world and telling us from your perspective and the UN interface what's going on. My question to you, is it true from your experience that what you have alerted us to tends to be something that's seen either in autocratic countries or want to be autocratic countries? And in view of that, we haven't heard anything about China or Russia in terms of how they've used biometrics by comparison to some of the other countries that you've told us about. Thank you.
Desmond.
Desmond McNeil from Centre for Development and Environment, University of Oslo. Thank you. Very interesting and alarming introduction. You talked about the police having an interest and possibly quite soon getting access to some of this data. I wonder about the insurance companies, which perhaps are the next in line. Is that something you see already on the horizon? Thank you.
You see? Yes?
Hi, I'm Zi from Shanghai. And my question to Philip is that you mentioned about this digital welfare system in the UK, and then also you mentioned that this system is particularly unfavorable to those single mothers. So I simply wonder, like, what kind of solution you have towards like helping such a group, especially that I mean, there has been an argument saying that if the government is interfering too much, then we are actually making women more dependent on the whole system. So we might let the market or technology do their job. But then the only problem, as we have discovered, that our market and the technology sometimes can reproduce or replicate the existing inequalities in society. So it seems that we're actually left with a dilemma. So what kind of solution you might have for that?
Yes, Barbara Adams from Global Policy Forum. I think your presentation gave a very good illustration, as you commented, on the important role of special rapporteurs and the UN and human rights dimensions. I wonder if you'd make a comment or two about the broader landscape of how the digital questions are coming up in the context of the UN. We've recently had a Secretary General's high-level panel, for example, on digital cooperation. And also about the whether you came across any of the ways in which different parts of the UN system are under a lot of pressure to work with the private sector because of the whole crisis on the funding side and so on. Some of the intrusion you described, which is coming in other ways. Thanks.
Thank you.
very
And I
much.
think this is going to be the last question. Is that right? Okay. This is the last question.
Thank you. Cornelia Walter, for the past with UNICEF and currently writing a book. Fascinating overview that you gave. Two questions, actually. One, you gave a really interesting overview of countries and their attitude towards using technology for cost saving. I was wondering if you have spoken to the giants like Google and Amazon, what's their attitude? And the second one, behavior economics. Like this new drive towards technology and big data offers a treasure of data to shape and influence behavior. I was wondering if you could touch on that. Thank you.
So, enormous range of wonderful questions. And you've got 2 minutes. Actually, I'm very generous. I'll give you 5. Or 4, maybe.
I think the answer to all questions was yes. So, first question was about, I think, primarily focused on countries like China and Russia. I think one of the things that's interesting, at least I don't know much about what Russia is doing in internal terms, in terms of its digitization and so on. I do know a fair bit about what China is doing, and I think the picture is actually a rather more complicated one than we often hear. Certainly the social credit system is moving ahead in certain parts of China. We have talked a lot in recent weeks, for good reason, about what happens in Xinjiang and the sort of surveillance and other ways in which new technologies are being used. But social credit certainly has very high aspirations in China to be evaluating virtually everything that people do and then giving them rewards or punishments. I think something like the latest figure I saw was 6 million people have been denied train tickets because they don't measure up, etc. But I think it is interesting to actually look more closely at the ways in which we in the West are developing our own private sector-driven forms of social credit. There's a very interesting part of Black Mirror, the series that illustrates the extent to which social ratings systems are starting to apply in our own society, so we get all sorts of benefits and so on. We are not given access to various other things, and that can be expanded quite significantly if you look at the work of Shoshana Zuboff. The aspirations of surveillance capitalism could get us fairly close to a social credit system, but without government intervention, I think. So it's complex. Insurance companies, I mean, I think that's already happening. They are certainly going to be adjusting their premiums and the extent to which they're willing to insure certain people in the absence of regulation. It's only rational. If they know that my baby is already predisposed to certain extraordinarily expensive pathologies or illnesses, whatever, unless they're prevented from discriminating in that way, all of this information is already being crunched. In terms of the United Kingdom, I think the point I was trying to make is that you have an unhappy marriage of technology and neoliberal ideology. So the technology enables us to be tracking very carefully the single mother and everyone else, and knowing exactly what they're doing and punishing and rewarding and so on. The neoliberalism is also a sort of moralistic one, where these women shouldn't, of course, have had children if they can't afford them. And that's official government policy in the UK. They have what they call a two-child cap, that you cannot get benefits for more than 2 children. And if you've got 4, sorry, honey, I should have thought about it before you got pregnant. Sure. You know, it's really, that is back to sort of poorhouse ethics, that the poor shouldn't be reproducing. And of course, it's not the poor. The poor could be me, going along very nicely, then suddenly a car accident or a health problem or loss of job, and I've got my 4 children, and I go along and say I need help, and they say, sorry, we're going to support 2 of them, that's it. So I think it's that constellation of technology plus the philosophy which is the real problem. I don't doubt for a moment, I mean, there is it's very easy to fall into an anti-tech mentality in a lot of this and say, well, they simply shouldn't use it, etc. But I'm not of that disposition at all. I think tech offers immense possibilities, and we don't have much of a choice but to embrace those, but we have to regulate them. And the one point I didn't say earlier, which is really important to get on the table, and even our friend from WHO earlier used the magic word, God damn him, ethics. There's no human rights in sight. The tech industry does not recognize human rights. They are not relevant. They constantly talk about ethics. Endless sets of ethical guidelines which have no significant human rights links at all. And as long as you're focused on ethics, it's mine against yours. I will define what is fairness, what is transparency, what is accountability. There are no universal standards. There are no standards that have been worked out over the last 70 years through endless international law and other mechanisms. And the various big tech leaders say that often. But how do we know what universal values are? I mean, things in China are very different from things in Australia. So therefore we have to do it. Disaster. The role of the UN, I mean, it's a depressing scene in the UN because governments are now starving the UN of resources. I think the United States plus Brazil are responsible for about 70% of the non-payment of dues, which is leading to ever more cutbacks within the UN system. But in any event, what you have is the Secretary General and others saying, look, if you're still interested in the SDGs, it's over to the private sector. there's no government money. We're not going to be able to do this private sector. And that is, again, I think, a sellout, I'm afraid. I'm not saying that he has any choice, but it's then the same when it comes to regulating technology. We had a panel last week with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the head of Amnesty International, Shoshana Zuboff, and Chris Hughes, co-founder of Facebook. And the final question put to the High Commissioner and to Kumi Naidu, the head of Amnesty, was, do you guys have the resources to be doing anything in the tech area? And of course, they both had to mumble and saying, well, it's very, very, very important. Yeah, well, of course. It's, but, you know, the reality is they've got a handful of people with very limited expertise. They're not, it's not even David and Goliath. It's a tragic situation. Attitude of big tech to these things, you know, I mean, I don't have any access to big tech. I'm very little UN human rights. But I have seen nothing from any of these companies that indicates other than a very firm foothold in the neoliberal set of assumptions about the role of government versus the role of the private sector. Big data, how can it shape and influence behavior? No question. Big data has huge capacity. You read Noah Yuval Harari about the extent to which all of our current choices and perceptions are heavily influenced by the manipulation of big data through algorithms and so on. And I think that's only going to increase dramatically in the years ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are definitely over time, so I'm sorry that we have to close it, but it's been fantastic how you've emphasized not only the sort of what we so often hear about, you know, sort of terrible decisions being made by this system or the other, but the basic systemic issues of what is driving it and the motivations, the purposes to which these technologies are being put to basically punish the poor. And also the gap, the lack of effort to invest. So it's an issue of priorities, you know? I mean, in how this technology is being used, much less being used to actually solve problems of exclusion and marginalization. The fact that you cannot understand the driving force of technology without looking at the context of neoliberal economic systems and the actors who are driving it. So thank you so much for this very inspiring speech. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.